family law attorney. I've been doing this for about 25 years. And over about the last decade or so, I've developed a little bit of a niche in what you would call, in what's called the parental alienation area. Most matrimonial and family law attorneys have heard of parental alienation, but it's really not their niche. And the way I describe parental alienation, how it differs from other types of custody and visitation cases, it's when one parent attempts to destroy the relationship between a child and the other parent. So it's not just your typical run-of-the-mill custody case. It's it's something more severe where they're trying to sever the relationship entirely. So what I heard about the COVID lockdown, obviously, I became very, very concerned for parents, for two types of parents. Parents who are either victims of parental alienation and now they have to deal with the COVID on top of it, and then also parents who are fearful of becoming victims of parental alienation. And I have been getting quite a lot of calls. I actually say that the COVID is almost a perfect laboratory for parental alienation. You almost can't create a better laboratory for alienating a child than with COVID, because basically what you have is oftentimes a child will have even though they may have a relationship with both parents, they may be much closer to one parent than the other, or even, varying degrees. But if they're closer to one parent, they may be spending more time with that parent. And now you have COVID, and what happens is they're with that parent 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days. And the parent, if that parent wants to alienate, they have all the time in the world to do that. And I have seen, as I said, I've seen parental alienation cases go from bad to worse. And I've seen ordinary custody cases go all the way to, parental alienation. So I've been getting a lot of I'm not a little bit more low tech than Susan here. So you have to apologize. I don't have a PowerPoint presentation. I'm just going to go back and forth and refer to my notes a little bit because I have a lot to discuss. But I've gotten a lot of calls from parents who have told me that they've been using the lockdown as an opportunity to alienate the children, and they're confident that there's nothing that either that parent can do or nothing that the courts can do, because they know right now the courts are in lockdown, and they're only taking emergency applications. Now, one would think or assume that parental alienation constitutes an emergency. Well, when you're dealing with the courts that don't even know or understand parental alienation, they're certainly not going to consider that an emergency. The kinds of things they're dealing with that they consider emergencies are parents who, the obvious types of cases where you're dealing with domestic violence, child abuse, all the way up to parents that don't pay child support, which is ironic because you would think if they're dealing with a parent not paying child support as an emergency, that if a parent is having their parenting time withheld or interfered with, that would be considered an emergency. Unfortunately, for this particular lockdown, they don't consider it an emergency. So you see a lot of this going on. I also see a lot of calls, the excuses that they're giving. Sometimes these parents have custody orders. In the past, the parent wouldn't send the child, or the child would refuse to go. The other parent would go back to court. They would complain. They say they would file a petition. Here, what these parents are doing is they're using the COVID to say that, well, I'm not violating an order, but I'm concerned for my child's safety. This is a safety issue. And we've actually seen some cases that have come out of the courts where they've said, well, no, this isn't alien. They haven't used the word alienation, but this is a safety issue, and the safety of the children come first. And then I've also gotten a bunch of calls about where parents are supposed to get Skype telephone calls during the COVID, and the other parent is either not, and this is the same as even before COVID, they're not answering the calls, they're monitoring the telephone calls. Sometimes they're deliberately distracting the children with electronic devices so that they're not really fully engaged on the telephone calls with the other parent. So these kinds of things are only getting worse and worse. So what I tell, what I advise parents who are in situations like this is a couple of things. So and for children that have a relationship where they're what I would call the where it looks like a situation where parental alienation is kind of on the horizon, but it's not yet risen yet, and the children are being told all these things about safety and so forth, is that when they speak to their children on the phone to say that their home's also a safe place because they're also in a lockdown, right? You're in a lockdown, I'm in a lockdown. So if both homes are safe places, your home is following protocols, our home is following protocols. So if the other parent who is trying to alienate does that, they could tell the child that. To let the child know that it's a safe place to sleep over, to spend time. The children sometimes are worried that if during this pandemic that there's not going to be food over at the house or games to play, or they'll be bored or hungry, and to let the children know that that's not going to be the case. And of course, to let them know that they love them. And I advise them what they shouldn't do as well. This is a very, very frustrating time. Under normal circumstances where you have parental alienation, it's a very frustrating time. But in a situation like this, it's heightened, with the COVID. So the first thing I say is don't threaten the other parent or the child. Don't make threats. I know that these parents, they get very frustrated. Their children are being withheld from them. They're being alienated. Don't make threats because it could lead to an order of protection. And that actually is considered an emergency. So it would actually work in reverse. What would happen is the court would not pay attention to the parental alienation. The other person would bring a family offense petition, and they would just wind up in court on an order of protection. So it would actually go from bad to worse. So, it's very hard, but I tell a lot of these parents to please try to stay as calm as possible, not to yell, not to scream. And this is a point that Susan has made, which is, in a parental alienation case, usually, although not often, the alienating parent comes across as the calm one, and the one that's being alienated comes across as the quote-unquote crazy one, because they're yelling and screaming. But why are they yelling and screaming? It's because they're being alienated from their child. This is the normal reaction, but the court doesn't see it that way. They don't see that as the normal reaction. They see a person standing in front of them screaming, and they think, oh, this is the reason why the alienation is going on. And this gets even worse. So I do tell parents to remember a few things during this COVID. One, that children are not. I say that children are not their true selves when they're being alienated. This is not who they really are. This is a child that is under the influence of brainwashing. So they're acting as a brainwashed person would act. So when parents get frustrated and angry, is to remind them this is not really who their true child is. This is a child who's being alienated and brainwashed. I also let them know that the lockdown is going to be over at some point. The courts are going to be open. And at some point, some parental alienation can be reversible. Not always, but sometimes it can be reversible with proper reunification therapy. Susan touched upon this as well. I'll go through it a little bit as well. But it can be reversible, not to give up hope on your children. So that's kind of the short spiel that I give to parents when I get them on the phone over the last month and a half to 2 months since this started. Did you want to add something, Susan?
No, I love what you say. I love the when you said this is the perfect laboratory. And for those of you who don't know, and I will tell you, I've been doing this for years, and I was also an alienated parent. While this I specialize in, because it happens that quickly. No longer am I. He's in the other room. But that said, I think back when my clients call me, this would have been the perfect Petri dish. Perfect.
Yeah.
because when your child is being alienated and they at least go to school during the day, and a lot of times I give people action plans. Look, you can take a card, have it put in their mailbox at school. The school counselor can give them a card, something. There are action plans that can be put into place during those situations. But now this person has the kid 24/7. And by the way, alienators are hyper-focused on this. They're hyper-focused. So if they have the child in their house, and maybe you're finding this, it's not like they're going about their business and the child's watching TV and then can step away and maybe text mom. No. They really have an iron grip on these kids. And as far as reunification, I do mention that to my clients now, but that has to be something that's typically court ordered, as you know, Jordan. So, and that's hard enough to get as it is. And Jordan's absolutely right. The courts either don't understand. They know the word phased parental alienation, but okay. And so, why am I losing this? And so that said, I don't know what's happening. Can you still see me?
Yeah, I see you.
Okay, then that's fine. Just
and
like
I see my video. I'm going to try to flip this to see if.
No. It's just I got something weird up on my screen, but I don't care about it. It's just an iCloud message. So it can be reversed. I have mentioned reunification. I'm a little cautious to say that right now because you at least here in Maryland, and I know most states, you do need a court order for that. You have to get in front of a judge. Reunification programs usually require that the alienating parent have no contact with the child for several months, usually like a 90-day window. And that all has to be precipitated by the courts. And the courts are just, I don't want to say they're dormant, but you're right. Unless somebody's really beating up the kid or not paying you're right, they're not paying child support. That's a hand slap. But parental alienation doesn't get them anywhere. So I try to tell them to continue to reach out, send emails, send texts, make suggestions of getting together. And Jordan's 100% right. These kids are not acting themselves. When I talk to adults who've been alienated, many times they will say to me, my childhood was one person and now I'm another person. Because they weren't able to develop properly. This really does change their whole chemistry, their brain chemistry, their everything about the child. So all I can really say at this point is still be proactive. Jordan's right. The courts will open up soon. And wow.
Yeah.
Explained to a judge, and I actually had a parent call me who I could tell was the alienator, Jordan. And I said, have a good time now. You're hurting your kid, and the courts will open up. Explain to a judge while you used this period to keep your child away from their other parent. Have a nice life. And they were like, well, what I meant was, and they started to switch their gears because.
Yeah, so
like that. If I can add just to this, for the people who have, it's for those mental health professionals who have younger kids, when the kids are 5, 6, 7, 8, and a parent's violating, the other parent, the targeted parent, really does have some respite there. They file a contempt charge. Either the other parent is violating or they're not. And judges, while you don't want to use the word parental alienation because they seem to hate that, but what judges really don't like is to hear that somebody's interfering with visitation. The child's supposed to be dropped off every other Friday. They don't get dropped off until Sunday. The other parent does that repeatedly. Judges don't like that. And parents who do that are really at the risk of losing their custody arrangements and having a judge, and I'll say this to people, and by the way, you could lose your custody arrangement and you could see your child on a Wednesday and a Saturday at McDonald's with a social worker sitting next to you. So you may want to cut this out.
Well,
kids. The problem is the older kids. For some reason, the courts like to give 13, 14, and 15-year-olds a decision on which parent they like better. Isn't that nice to have a child make that horrible decision? Talk about splitting. And that's where it gets a little cloudy because, as Jordan said, the parents, the calm parent, and then the one who's all upset, who is actually usually the better parent, that's the one who may lose custody. And that's the gray area because the alienator knows that they can parade the child into court. Not that that's a good idea. I mean, how many children, 15, 16, 13, go to court to testify against the other parent? Again, alienator doesn't care. They have a mission. But that's where it gets hairy, because those children do get a choice. I don't want to say a choice, but the judge will listen very heavily to what that person has to say. So when people come to me with the young ones, and they go, I feel so lost. I go, no, actually, you're in a good position, because the law's very clear with these little ones. Do you agree with that, or do you run into anything different, Jordan, with age groups?
I think it's actually easier to alienate children in the teenage year. It almost seems counterintuitive. You would think the younger the child is, the easier it would be. But reunification therapy seems to be something that has greater success with younger children, whereas in the teenage years it gets harder. The teenagers that come out, they say this. They know what to say. They say, well, this is not me. This is not my mom or my dad saying this. This is me saying this. And they could be a lot more persuasive. So, and they're also, there are other issues going on with teenagers. There's hormones and everything else. You got to add all of that into and then on top of it, you got the alienation. And then you also have, they're in a lockdown with the COVID. It's really just an explosive situation that what we have here.
For the mental health professionals, one of the things that you can do that Linda Gottlieb does that I think is that is just wonderful. And that is, you have the child bring in, now, of course, if you have the alienating parent bringing the child in and the other parent, you don't have a situation. But if you do, and you should be able to have discourse with both parents. And by the way, if you don't, you got alienation. If you have one parent saying, look, you can't get in touch with the dad, or you can't get in touch with the mom, they're not around, they don't care, unless they're 6 feet under, you have a right to be able to communicate with them. And what seems to be wonderful with reunification is when you have that parent, the one who's targeted, sit down with the child, you're attempting to do this on your own, and the child says, we never did anything together, they're terrible. Have that other parent bring photo album. The photo albums of Disney World, the beach, the this, the that, all the things that they did with that parent. That starts to bring a flood of memories back, whether the child just had them in the background, or if they were repressing those memories. A lot of times that opens up the floodgates. Now, the problem with reunification, when the child isn't taken away from the other parent for 90 days, and that seems to be a sweet spot number. I don't know why it is, but it seems to be, and I won't argue it. When you're trying to do it where where the children are still gone between the two homes, according to Richard Borshak, who authored the book Divorce Poison, he said that doesn't work, because then the kids go right to the other parent. But if you have them young enough, if they're younger and the hormones haven't kicked in and the enticements, remember, you've got a 14-year-old who you're enticing with car keys. By the way, next year when you drive, here's the car that you drive. By the way, your dad's not allowed in it. Those kind of things are harder to interfere with. But the little ones, you can get right in there pretty
yeah. And the court,
I'm not saying the older ones aren't a lost cause. I'm not saying that at all. It's just sometimes clients feel like it's harder with the little ones, where it actually is not.
Yeah, I haven't seen the 90-day so much up here in New York. I know that, a lot of judges, and this is even before COVID, were very hesitant they're very hesitant to do much of anything, unfortunately. Particularly when they have something called a Lincoln hearing or an in-camera hearing, where the child goes into the back with his or her attorney and tells the judge, all sorts of things about the other parent, and why they don't want to see them. And it takes an astute judge to really get to understand what's really going on. And some do and some don't. The ones that get it are going to do something about it. The ones that don't get it are going to kind of lift up their hands and say, there's nothing that I can do. I've experienced it both ways in the courts, unfortunately. So what we have now is a situation where we see the parental alienation or the interference with custody is, at this moment in time, we're just reaching out to the courts and asking for emergency conferences. We can't go in person, but they will take them. We've actually been doing emergency conferences through Skype Business, and they'll contact everyone on the line. It'll be the attorney. The parties are not even allowed to be in on the conference. So right now it's just, yeah, so it's the judge. It's normally the judge's law secretary, a court reporter who's taking notes over Skype Business, the attorneys for both parents, and the attorney for the child or children. And you argue your what's going on, what's been happening with the alienation. And even if there is a judge who is very forceful and forthcoming and says, this is my order, and I expect that you will follow this order, or else. The question becomes, well, if they don't, and we get back to court, so what's going to wind up happening is hopefully the courts are going to open up slowly, little by little. And there may be, tenfold the number of parental alienation cases, or varying degrees, anything from, interfering with visits or telephone calls, all the way to full-blown alienation. And the courts are going to be slammed with these cases.
No, absolutely.
They're going to wind up telling a lot of people who haven't seen their children for months to go out in the hallway and see what they can do to settle the case. Now, what Susan pointed out is a lot of the alienators in the true alienation cases. One thing I do is I try to distinguish between custody cases and alienation cases. The main, not everyone gets that. In the custody cases, there's a lot of this back and forth. We all know this, but where it crosses over to alienation is where the parent tries to sever the relationship with the other parent. And oftentimes that other parent is incapable of empathy. There's a number of different, and again, I am also not a therapist, but there's a number of different terms that are used, whether it ranges from sociopath, antisocial, borderline personality. I know they all have different meanings under the DSM, I'm sure, but the running theme with all the alienating parents is that there is a lack of empathy, and not just a lack of empathy for the other parent, but also a lack of empathy for their own children, because their own children are going to suffer psychological harm because of it. And not having that empathy for their own children, and then to have a judge maybe 3 months from now to say, listen, I have 100 cases on my or 1,000 cases. You got to go out in the hall and settle this, figure this out. Whatever happened during the pandemic happened, and we got to figure this out. It's going to be a real mess. It's going to take someone to really stand up there and say, no, this is not an ordinary situation. It's not an ordinary, safety or this or that. This has been going on for a while. The COVID was used to exacerbate this, and it's gotten even worse. And it's just a bad situation. Unfortunately, the attorneys and their clients are going to have a really, really bad situation to deal with in these alienation cases when the courts open up, unfortunately. And who knows when that's even going to happen.
Right. The other thing, too, I'd like to mention here, because you said about custody cases, interesting enough, all of my, as you know, I'm a divorce coach, and people come to me when they're contemplating divorce and how to find the right attorney and those type, and figure out their finances. And that's all very well and good. The parental alienation calls that I get, which is a lot, the inquiries, are post-divorce. These aren't custody battles any longer. This isn't about we're trying to figure it out and he's a jerk or she's a jerk, and I don't want to share physical blah. It's, we've been divorced for 2 years. Why is this happening now? The divorce was final 6 months ago. We're supposed to have 50-50, and she didn't bring the kids back last week. And I also find, I usually ask this question, are you dating somebody else? And they go, well, actually, yeah, I just met somebody. For some reason, that seems to be a catalyst. And listen, if you've been divorced 2 years and you start to date somebody, you are well within your rights. And then voila, here comes former spouse, and they're trying to alienate your child from you. Because why? For what reason? Only because you're now dating, you have your own life, you're allowed to. I hear a lot of that. Do you, Jordan, or are most of yours, because you are a matrimonial attorney, within the framework of getting a divorce, or do you have people come back to you, or come to you because they're having alienation?
Well, a lot of the alienation cases do occur post-divorce. As you know, alienation oftentimes starts, you know, it could start as early on as right after the children are born, when one of the parents says, you know, you don't know how to change the diaper right. Let me do it. Let me take care of it. And no, most people don't normally think of that as alienation at the time, but you know, it's kind of like a seed right there, you know, and there's a certain type of personality that goes into this. And then once the custody case starts, there's the alienation. But oftentimes in the most severe situations, these cases go on for many years after the parties are divorced. You would think, okay, we're divorced, it's done. I have my visitation order or my parenting schedule, and you have yours, and I'm going to spend time. When I spend time, and for a lot of people, you know, because I guess maybe they have some kind of personality disorder, they can't seem to let it go. And they put their children in the middle, and the way that they have control over this other person, even years after they've been divorced, is through the children, and they alienate. And I see this happening, a decade after the divorce is done. It's still going on. Yeah.
I also want to mention something here, if I could, and that is oftentimes the courts will use this phraseology, high conflict. And that comes off, and I don't want to pick apart language or contentious versus high conflict, but the courts have this overriding feel that, well, he does something to her, so she responds to him, and it's an escalation because both parties are feeding into it and they both get something out of it. I want to say, and a lot of times they think that that's what parental alienation is. Oh, well, she's doing this to the kid, and then he does it with the kid, and then she does it. And this is their dynamic. Let me make this really clear. That's not parental alienation. The parent who's being targeted wants their own life, and they want to have the relationship with their child. And interesting enough, they want their child to have the relationship with the other parent. That's all they want. They don't want this. They don't want this. I haven't had an alienator. And interesting enough, the clients that come to me who are being alienated, they say, look, I don't want to take my child away from her mother. I just want to be able to see my daughters. The alienator will say something like, he doesn't deserve to see these kids. So listen to the language of the parent. Do you see that at all, Jordan?
Or they'll say, you know, well, the kids will be fine. They'll be fine without the other parent. You know, they've been fine with me all this time, and they'll be fine. And there's just a complete dismissal of the importance of having a relationship with the other parent. You know, it's interesting you mentioned that the courts do oftentimes the difference between high conflict and that, you know, when you try to explain to the courts, this is not what a typical high conflict divorce case, this idea that once the parties are divorced, it's going to disappear. When someone has this kind of personality disorder, it's not about the conflict of divorce. Once the divorce is done, the person's going to keep doing it. And yeah, you're right, absolutely right. A lot of judges don't get that. And, you know, I find that this kind of stuff happens even in maybe it's a little bit easier for courts to understand in cases that are not high conflict. You know, one example that I gave, one of my first cases this is when I was first starting, I didn't even really have a very good understanding of what parental alienation was. Actually, I'll give two examples. And neither one of them were what I would consider high conflict. And I really could not recognize parental alienation at that point. I didn't know what it was. And then as I learned about it, I saw what was going on. One was a situation where teenagers did not want to see, in this case, I had the alienated parent, didn't want to see my client. And the explanation was that, well, we don't know why, which is right away a weird thing, right? If you hear like, well, you have two children, you don't know why they don't want to see the other parent? And they said, no, we have no idea why. At one point, they gave an excuse that one of the kids caught my client smoking a cigarette, and they never want to see them or talk to them again. And then in another situation, you had very young children where in this case, I actually represented the alienator. I had no idea I was representing an alienator. I had no experience with this. And the children came and the father came over, and the children would just hide underneath the dining room table. They were frightened of their father. And I asked my client, why are they frightened of their dad? It's their dad. And she says, well, I don't know. And so what I actually did is, and this is, I wrote an article for the Law Journal, and I had suggested like a 3-part test of almost like a rebuttable presumption of what the court should use for determining parental alienation. So just bear with me 1 second. The judge that originally saw the parental alienation case was a very good judge up in Rochester County, but I don't think that he quite grasped what was going on. So I kind of suggested this 3-part test. I mentioned the fact that a lot of parental alienation goes on behind closed doors, right? That in courts love evidence. They want to know, well, what is the evidence of parental alienation? We don't see any evidence here. And these are 2 examples, these 2 cases where, one, the kids just the teenagers don't want to see their father. Another one's the children were frightened of their father. And I also want to point out is that parental alienation is about 50-50 between mothers and fathers. Mm-hmm. There's some people think that it's fathers being alienated by mothers. My experience is it's about half and half. It's not gender specific. But the first, so I came up with a 3-part test, which the first thing is that parental alienation, just trying to find it, I'm sorry. That the first is that it's natural for a child to want to have a relationship with both parents, absent a compelling reason why the child would not want to do so. So the natural order of things is that 99.999% of children, if not 100% of children, want to have a relationship with both parents, absent a compelling reason. And I don't know if Susan pointed this out. There are even children who are victims of child abuse or domestic abuse, and even they want to have relationships with the parents who have physically or mentally abused them. And then the second thing that I said is, absent any reasonable explanation why the child would not want to have that relationship, the court should have a rebuttable presumption that parental alienation should be considered a strong probability because of the fact that this evidence oftentimes is behind closed doors. And then the third thing is that, and this is something that was said by Amy Baker, is that parental alienation is a form of child abuse. The court doesn't view this typically as a form of abuse, but it is a form of abuse. It's a form of psychological abuse of a child. The child, is growing up believing that one of their parents are, believing a false narrative, essentially, that one of their parents is terrible. Under most circumstances, parents realize that they have 2 parents and they both have flaws, right? Everybody has flaws. Both of their parents have flaws. But in an alienation case, what you see oftentimes happening is that the parent that's doing the alienation, their flaws are minimized, if not recognized by the child at all. And then the parent who is being alienated, their flaws are, highlighted to such an extent that they can do no right. And that's something that Susan had mentioned as well. So those were my 2 cases that I dealt with early on. I since then have had many, many other parental alienation cases. Recently during COVID, I got a call from someone who told me that that the mother was telling the child that it's, you're not safe over at your father's house, for health reasons. They actually had 2 children, telling them you're not safe. It's not safe over there. Actually telling the children, you need to stand up to your father and tell them that you don't want to go over there. Now, this was right before COVID, and Susan mentioned how quickly parental alienation can happen. Immediately prior to COVID, the kids were spending 50-50 time with both parents and had a great relationship with both parents. And apparently, but the mother was known to have sociopathic. She was a sociopath, but once COVID hit, that's when she went into overdrive. She would daughter she would pull the children over to his house. The daughter, who's a teenager, would get out, fold her arms, and say, "I'm not going." And the son would go, but the son was so frightened of germs and how unsafe it was. The child would wash his hands so many times that he would wash his hands raw. The hands would be raw. The mother also, against a court order, went out and got a therapist for the older child. The older child needs therapy. One thing that was pointed out is, ordinary therapy is not appropriate in a parental alienation case because a couple of things. One, the child will tell the therapist that the alienated parent, they don't want to go over there, they don't feel safe. And the therapist, their job is to, the child is their client. So they will then just say, well, I don't feel it's appropriate for the child to go over there. And then the alienation actually gets worse. I've had some experience since COVID where the therapy has been taking place over Zoom or different things. Everyone's adapting and doing therapy. I would imagine that doing a therapy session over Zoom has its own challenges. And in an alienation case, maybe even therapists who are adept at picking up some of these signs of alienation, it may be a little bit more difficult with the technology. So, it's ongoing, and it's actually been getting worse. And no one really knows what's going to happen when the courts open. But I could tell you there's going to be a ton of alienation cases the moment the courts open up. And hopefully they will take them very seriously. But we don't really know. We don't know. They may just want to try to resolve cases as quickly as possible, unfortunately.
There's no doubt that there will be things that fall through the cracks, but for the mental health professionals that are on here, one of the things that I think is really important to note, and that is pay attention to the behavior of the parent. I know if they're bringing the child in, the child is your client. If you have a parent who's very hyper-focused on the other parent, they're coming in and they say things like, the other parent is this, and this, and this, and this, and this. That's really